Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel.
Michael White of La Crosse is a Green Bay candidate for governor. The election is November 6th. Dr. White, thank you for visiting WisconsinEye.
My pleasure.
First time you're running for office. Short, emphasis short version of your bio, please.
So I'm retired military. The Navy paid for med school. I paid off the Navy, spent a couple of years in grad school poisoning rats, then switched to the Air Force. Along the way, I became a dermatologist. Along the way, I helped invent TRICARE. And then I retired from the Air Force, ran a training program, moved up to Wisconsin after that. And unfortunately, I know Jill Stein. So I got roped into working on her campaign. I'm one of the people that helped run the recount, which I'd love to talk about. And then I got my arm twisted and they said, "We want you to run for office." And I said, "Okay." And never thought we'd get on the ballot. We don't get as much attention as we deserve, but I'm on the ballot and I'm here to talk about it.
And the short version of your credo, reason for running, is 2 sentences. I believe we must protect our children's future. We are running out of time. Elaborate.
So we have an existential threat. My number one issue is climate change and environmental destruction. When I was in grad school, I worked with pure dioxin in PBBs. You remember the PBB spill? Remember the chemicals that are showing up in our water? And I've had a long-term interest in environmental issues ever since. But climate change is on such a vast scale that most people feel that I can't do anything about it. Nothing I can do will make a difference. The optimistic projections, the latest series, says that our children will watch us lose most of the East Coast cities. The Southwest United States will become so dry that agriculture won't be able to be supported. 1/3 of the people on the planet are going to lose their water supply. And that's the optimistic projection. So my number one issue is protect my children's future. So I'm running for governor.
Well, your campaign website, we must stop burning fossil fuels. Is that the single most important change we could make in your number one issue of climate change?
Is fossil fuels the number one issue? There's about 7 at the top. That is number one, simply because that's what's contributing to climate change the greatest.
Then give me number 2 and 3 and 4.
Number 2 and 3 and 4, using environmental resources that are not renewable, destroying environmental resources with pollution. Let me define a Pruitt. A Pruitt is a short-term action, near-term action, a governmental decision, action by individuals, action by the court, for short-term benefit of a few people with terrible long-term consequences. And we can't afford any more Pruitts. We're making those happen on a daily basis, and I can give you lots of examples. The problem is the normal person is going to make decisions in their short-term interest, and you can't blame them for doing that. It's going to take concerted effort by a large group to get people to start paying to long-term consequences. That's what we need to change. Only a strong leader in government can do that. We don't want to do it with coercion. We want to do it with economic incentives. We want to do it with change in the way we do things. We want to do it with leadership, and that's what's missing.
Well, to follow up on that, the top 2 or 3 things that individuals can do in the area of climate change.
No, let's legit. Number 1, vote for me.
Okay.
Number 2.
Then I want number 2 and number 3. Go ahead.
Number 2 and number 3, look for renewable resources instead of things that you discard. So, for example, take the plastic straw. In some parts of the country, those are becoming illegal. We should either not use straws or use compostable straws. When you can afford to do solar power, you should do solar power. When you can take shorter trips, take shorter trips. When you can take mass transit, take mass transit. Think about the economic consequences of the food that you eat. We throw away, what, 40% of our food? Getting people to change their diet to change the planet isn't going to work. What we can do is change the incentives for people's behavior in a way that's constructive.
What would a Governor White do to implement what your campaign website calls a green fair deal? In other words, you're governor, you're presenting a budget, major changes. What's it look like?
What it looks like, number one, is find a way to work with the two parties that are in existence. Because if I win, which we all know is unlikely, I'm not Democrat and I'm not Republican. But I got to work with both of them, and neither one of them necessarily signs on to do what we're interested in doing. But I have an advantage. The two parties are locked in tribal warfare, us versus them. They're going to do what the party says, not necessarily what is right. So as a governor, I can start focusing on where can I get a victory today that's in the interest of the First Peoples, our Native Americans that are being ignored, that's in favor of using renewable resources, that's in favor of protecting our water, and I can highlight those and then work with whatever members of either party are willing to come together. A major example where that has worked recently well has been the opioid crisis. We have an opioid prescription system. I'm a physician. So if I write an opioid, there's a website that I have to go to check information. That's an example where bipartisan cooperation works. As a green governor, I can focus on incentives that protect the average person, the average worker, their salary, give everybody a living wage. A number two issue for me.
Is that $15 minimum wage?
I think so, but I get pushback in some rural areas where I've got a nurse that works with me. She said, I was raising kids on $12.50 an hour. We don't need 15. I don't know what it is. I would argue that the standard that seems to work is $15 an hour. The devil's in the details, but I would push for the best that I can get.
Wisconsin has not set, as you know, a new renewable energy standard in years. If you're governor, what new renewable energy standard would you recommend?
I hate it when people ask good questions that I haven't thought carefully enough about, but I would start by saying I would work with the other governors. There's a consortium of governors, for example, that are adhering to the Paris climate change, even when our imperious leader is not. So I would reach out to the other governors, every single one that's near us and every single one that's taking initiative, and I'd start by learning what the benchmark is. And then I would see if I could apply that to Wisconsin.
If you're governor, your transportation, your highway funding budget, how would it implement your goals, and how would you pay for highways? Because there's an impasse in the capital.
Well, yeah, exactly. You got to pay for anything you propose to do. You got to find a way to pay for it. Okay. And the most honest answer is I don't know all the details yet because I've never done this before. Okay. But for example, I would see if I could revisit some of our mass transit options, the light rail, which we threw away. Okay. I would focus on anything that I could generate as a source of revenue to help support transit. But I would work with the existing governmental agencies and say, okay, we'll start with zero-based budgeting. We've got to live within the money that we have. Where are our priorities? How do we adjust it? And instead of being dictatorial from the top down, I would start by respecting the government employees that we have that know their job and find a way to make it work.
You willing to accept either a gas tax and or an increase in $75 you and I pay to register our vehicle?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, you got to pay for it. Okay. So the issue is getting the common good and getting people to buy on that you're doing something for the common good, and then swallowing a short-term pain for a long-term benefit, and avoiding having that get torpedoed by special interests.
Your position on tolling, potentially?
If that's what it takes to make it work, that's what we do.
Okay. As a physician, what would your budget include on health care? Rural areas, Medicaid, etc.
Number one, we've got to rein in the excessive costs of health care. So I'm going to give you some concrete examples. The biologics are a new class of medicine that are transforming medicine. They're transforming psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease. But the average cost of a biologic is 50% more than the median income. We can't afford that, okay? It transforms quality of life, but if everybody's got to pay that, where's that going to come from? Where it's going to come from is companies that are paying insurance are either going to stop paying insurance, or their workers are going to get paid less in order to pay for the cost of these drugs. A cheap steroid that I use on a regular basis. In September of 2014, a tube of this steroid was $9 and change. 3 months later, same tube, $175, a 20-fold increase. You know, I'm in favor of a free market where it's appropriate, but that's not a free market, that's extortion. That is a monopoly, and you're suffering it, I'm suffering from it, my patients are suffering from it. I have people in tears every week because they can't afford basic medicines. So I would start by seeing what we could do to rein in drug costs. Then I would focus on availability of basic services throughout the state, because there are areas where it's simply not available. Are there areas where we can reduce or change the pricing structure so we don't have artificial prices to reflect billing quirks? I don't know. I always get asked, are you in favor of single-payer health care? I'm in favor of whatever we can do to get there. I see problems with single-payer health care, but guess what? What we're doing isn't working. Okay? It's not a question of either or, which is what the current two-party system gives us. It's a unipolar, unidimensional, bipolar, yes, no, up, down. Wait a minute. The devil's in the details. We have a choice. We need to stop voting our fears and start voting for what's right for the people.
The issues are different in rural Wisconsin.
Absolutely.
You have more health.
I live in rural Wisconsin.
You have more health care provided by Medicaid and Medicare. You have older residents. Sadly, their household incomes on average in northern Wisconsin is lower than the state average. So how would you continue and improve health care in rural areas? Or is that part of the package you just outlined?
Well, I would say it's part of the package that I just outlined, and the reality is that until we get into the details and I know what's possible, I can't give you a detailed answer. But I live in rural Wisconsin. I live 15 miles from the nearest traffic light. My patients are my neighbors. They can't afford the medicines that I want to prescribe at times. So I'm living in that reality, and I feel their pain. I know what they're dealing with. And I'm hoping that that will allow me to work with the legislators and say, okay, get off your perch, get off your dogma, let's find some solutions.
State government and Delta Dental have a program that provides health care, dental care in underserved areas. Would that be a big part of Governor White Medicaid budget? Continuation or expansion?
I would continue any program that's working, and I think that that is working.
Okay. Does state government have a duty or an obligation to retain and recruit doctors, nurses, other healthcare professionals?
Yes. State government has a duty to provide an educational system that provides for the welfare of the state in which they work. I also serve on the Wisconsin Medical Society, and so we consider those kinds of issues on a regular basis. When I used to run a training program, I would concentrate on selecting physicians that were likely to stay in Dayton, Ohio, where I lived, as opposed to people that would come, get training in dermatology, and then go back to somewhere where they can make a lot of money. There's no system which is going to guarantee everything, but I think that state policies should reflect things that improve the availability of services for state residents, including our education system.
Well, let's talk about that. What would be in your Governor White budget for K-12 funding of schools? The current budget had a significant increase. I don't know if you think it was enough, but would you boost K-12 spending on public schools?
What I would do is I'd find out from the educators throughout the system what enough is, because I don't think we're doing enough right now. It's enough, say, for Madison. I don't think it's enough for downtown Milwaukee. I don't think it's enough for the rural school districts throughout the state, where we're seeing school districts close because the population is shrinking. How do you maintain a good school in a small district when the demographics are changing? I think that in a white administration, and that's my name, I don't want to have racial overtones, but in my administration, my goal would be to ensure that everybody throughout the state of Wisconsin has access to a top quality education opportunity. Okay, and it's going to mean more support in areas with less resources. It's going to mean finding ways to get around paying for school systems purely on property tax, because that's not working uniformly. I don't know what the right answer is, so I would start by asking the communities, I would start by asking the educators, I would start by asking the families, what's working, what's not working, and what's an innovative solution.
Have you thought about changes you would make in Wisconsin's tax structure to potentially come up with additional aid to our schools?
I really haven't, because the devil's in the details on that. I mean, I would like to say, let's get rid of funding education with property tax because there's too many inequalities. Okay, Michael, how does that work? So I don't know. Okay. But I think that we got to do something different than what we're doing now.
The choice, the voucher program has now expanded statewide. State aid for those students attending private schools. Would your first budget expand it, keep it, cut it back?
My gut answer is I would cut it back and limit it because I think vouchers help people mostly that don't need it and hurt the public schools. Okay. And we can't afford to hurt the public schools.
Local governments have been dealing with levy limits, putting restrictions on their ability to raise property taxes for about 15 years. Have you thought about whether those levy limits should be continued, dialed back, or repealed?
If we do a better job of financing the schools, we don't need to deal with the levy limits, okay? So I'm dodging the question a little bit. The answer is I really don't know because I haven't thought that level of detail. Okay. But I think it's limiting the quality of the schools that we have. By the same token, those parts of the state are usually economically hurting the most. So if you start levying more property tax or other taxes that are purely local, you're hurting the local economy disproportionately. So that doesn't sound like a good answer either. There's got to be another way. But if the only way to get it done is to take the levy limits off, that's what I'll do. My approach is trying to be pragmatic.
Wisconsin is spending $100 million in grants to make our schools safer. That's one step. Do we also need to change gun laws?
I like that question, especially because it is difficult to answer. I own guns. I trained in the military. I'm trained to use an automatic weapon. I support the Second Amendment. I don't support easy access to assault weapons or automatic weapons. I've had people give me a hard time for using either term for these weapons. I don't care. Nobody needs an AR-15, which has been modified for automatic fire in order to hunt deer. Okay? So yes, I support changes in gun laws that make those weapons impossible to get. I'll even sell my own guns if that's what it takes. I live in the country and I live in an area where we got critters and I need a gun. But I don't need those kinds of weapons.
What about what's been called the background checks loophole? Would you want that changed?
Yeah, I would. Because I don't want people to be able to get those kinds of guns. I don't want people to get the parts over the internet and the instructions on how to build them at home, and then you have a totally unregistered weapon that's not traceable.
The Department of Corrections budget, $1.1 billion, about 23,000 adult inmates in Wisconsin prisons. The prison in Green Bay and Waupun are built in the 1800s. Do we need a new prison? And the context there is some Democratic candidates for governor suggested that we could cut our prison population in half over the next few years. Where are you on those issues?
Well, I've been told that in certain parts of our state, we put many more blacks and low-income populations, low socioeconomic groups in prison than other states.
Wisconsin has the highest incarceration rate for African Americans.
Right, and that's not right. Okay, so we're doing something wrong. I think that when we put people in an overcrowded prison, that we're not doing anything to rehabilitate or change their lives. We're not helping our society for when they come out. So do we need more prisons? I think we do, but I think we need to look at why we're putting people in prison to begin with. And we need a situation where our police are partners with our community and not suppressing the community. I'm not saying they are suppressing, but I will tell you that there's a very divergent opinion in different parts of the state as to the nature of the police force and the role of the police force. We got to fix that. We've got to fix the causes of why people are getting put into prison, and the answer is not going to be simple and it's not going to be pretty, and I don't know that I know what the answers are. I just know that where we're at isn't working. We can't afford outdated prisons. We can't afford to put more people in prison. Are we putting them in for the appropriate reason? Are we getting them out and into the appropriate programs where they're not going to wind up going back to prison? Okay? And I don't think we're doing any of those right, but we can do better than we're doing, and I would focus on doing all of those that I could. But remember, I've got to work with the Democrats and the Republicans in the existing structures. So I'm going to start with first principles.
Where are you on tax breaks, tax incentives for private businesses against the backdrop of the approved tax breaks for Foxconn and the proposed tax breaks for Kimberly-Clark? What's your philosophy on helping businesses keep jobs or add jobs?
Devil's in the details. So in full disclosure, I own stock in Kimberly-Clark.
Okay.
I own stock in a lot of different companies because I've been an investor for many years. But let's talk about jobs in Foxconn. First of all, it took, in addition to the tax break, it took a Pruitt to make it possible for a pollution waiver. Okay, well that's okay because it's not going to hurt us. It's going to go downwind to Chicago. Come on, that's unreasonable. Having pollution breaks for companies that come in is unreasonable. Secondly, so they're going to give us what, 13,000 jobs? It's a $4.5 billion tax break for them.
State and local.
Right.
And as the governor's aides keep saying, they don't get a penny unless they actually invest up to $10 billion and create up to 13,000.
For how long? Okay, so the question is, how long are those jobs? Because Foxconn's model is come in, hire people for a while, build automatic factories. Hey, I got my tax break, I invested some money, and then those jobs over time disappear. Whereas if we had taken light rail, taken the money for light rail, it would have been long-term jobs, and I've heard the number of over 30,000. And so somebody was going to give us money, and it would generate jobs, it would generate a new rail system, it would pump money into the economy that would be durable, and we turned that down, but we're going to give away money for short-term jobs? That doesn't make any sense.
But if you're governor, in January, the state has existing binding contracts with Foxconn. What would be your philosophy on potential changes or see how those contracts play out?
You have to live within the law and deals that you've made, okay? You can't just walk away, okay, new administration, we're going to undo everything the previous administration does.
Those are binding contracts.
Exactly. I'm not going to engage in Trumpocracy, okay? We have to live with what we've done, but we can make sure we don't make those mistakes in the future, and if we see opportunities to modify it, we should do that.
What would your first budget as governor do for the Department of Natural Resources?
Restore it. Number one, I would put science back in the Department of Natural Resources. I would start by saying, what do we need to make it work? Where are the opportunities where the DNR can actually generate revenue? Okay, because I think that there are those. What elements of the DNR are appropriate for making Wisconsin a place people want to come visit, or protecting the natural resources of the state for the future? If that takes a budget that's twice as big as it has now, that's our goal. But remember, we've got to stay within a larger budget. But the first priority is I put science back into the budget. We get climate change issues back into the vocabulary where people are talking about. We start talking about protecting our water sources from pollution. We start addressing where those pollution sources are.
Can any mining project be done in Wisconsin without harming the environment, Mr. White?
Yeah, I think so.
You think so?
I think it's possible to do mining you've got to have mining in some states. We can't have NIMBY, not in my backyard. If everybody does the NIMBY dance, then there's never any mining, there's never any disposing of pollution. But it's got to make sense, it's got to be reasonable, it's got to be defendable, it's got to not be a Pruitt. It can't be something that benefits one company, one short-term interest to the detriment of the environment.
Has Wisconsin's frac sand industry been harmful to Wisconsin's environment?
I don't know, because there's a lot of heat and opinion on both of those. I've yet to see the hard data that I would like to see that can make me answer that question intelligently and specifically. I think I don't know. I think there's more emotion and more heat than there is light and data, and that's what we need.
UW system budget. Should we continue the freeze on resident undergrad tuition?
Kids are coming out of school with debt that is over $100,000. People that graduate from medical school have debts that are on the average $250,000 up before they earn their first paycheck. That's not sustainable. So we either have to keep the tuition freeze or find some way to deal with the student debt issue, because what are we looking at? 30% default rate on student debt? So I would say that if the costs are what they are because that's what you need to support the school, then the answer is, okay, find another way to provide funding for the students going to school that is not going to put the parents and the kids into the poorhouse to go to school.
As a physician, next steps Wisconsin should take to fight the epidemic of methamphetamine, opioid, heroin abuse and addiction.
We're moving in the right direction. I think the EPMD, if I'm using the initials correctly, program is working. I think we're doing, I have to get 2 hours of education about that. I think it's every 2 years. And I think that that is a bold first step because it's getting the physicians, frankly, we're part of the problem. We let the drug companies manipulate us. That's another rant. Drug companies manipulating physicians. I belong to nofreelunch.org. I never take money from drug companies for lunches or dinners or anything else. I don't want to be manipulated. And that's what happened with the opioid crisis, is that physicians were manipulated into writing the prescriptions. So the first step is doing what we're doing. The next step is identify all the people that are out there that are having problems, because I don't think we know the scope of the problem. So I think we take the legal stigma away from that and address it as a medical problem and identify those people, and then we address, and if necessary, hold the drug companies responsible, fiscally responsible for the damage that was done through their actions. When the drug companies see that those kinds of actions can lead to long-term consequences, that'll change their behavior. There were opportunities to prosecute the people behind the initiation of the opioid addiction problem, and federal government chose not to do that.
Time to legalize medical and/or recreational marijuana?
Absolutely.
Absolutely? On
Absolutely.
both?
Legal for sure, and I would tell you that we've got too many people in jail, so now we're going to put them in jail for possession, okay? The old fight drugs by locking people up system didn't work. Am I in favor of lots of people using? No, because if you're using and you're driving, that's as much risk as alcohol, and we don't have a good way to test for it. But our current system doesn't work, so we need to scrap it. And starting with scrap it, I would legalize it. I would say, let's take that off the table. Let's find another way to deal with it. Let's stop wasting resources on criminal marijuana behavior.
Campaign finance. Are you raising money to be competitive and have a viable campaign?
No. I'm getting what little money I can. It's partly self-funded, and it's very small donors, and it's on the order of hundreds, not thousands of dollars. We will not take large campaign donations, and we don't have the visibility to begin with, okay? We are, if you'll pardon the expression, a minor party. And so getting the visibility is part of the problem. So let's address for a moment, I'm going to bring it up, the last election. Did Jill Stein cost Hillary the election? Because that's actually related to what you're talking about. Number one, nobody owns a vote. It was Hillary's responsibility to earn the votes, and she didn't do it. Hillary lost the election on her own. Number two, if you want to give Jill's 32,000 votes to Hillary, which would have changed the election, by the way.
Yeah, because Trump won by 27,000.
Right, but you've also got of the 60,000 libertarian votes of Gary Johnson to Trump, okay, which would have swung it the other way. Number three, 60% or more of the people that voted for Jill based on exit polls wouldn't have voted otherwise. So she brought new votes into the system. Number four, we're back in the vote your fears. Vote against something you're afraid of instead of voting on your principles. So we want to fault the 32,000 people that voted their ethics and their principles because somebody else didn't get elected when they didn't earn our votes. That's bogus. We need to change the way we approach our funding to begin with. Finally, if you want to pick somebody at fault, it's the media. Here's what I mean by that. The media gave, and this is an estimate, $10 billion of free publicity early in the campaign to Donald Trump. You want to think that didn't sway the election? They totally failed to cover the alternative options that were available, including positions of substance. They ignored the multi-party nuanced conversation that we have going on in this country. Let's consider the tribes, the parties that we currently have. We have the Republican Party, the party of Trumpocracy, and the Tea Party. On the other side, we have the Democrats, the Demexits or the Berniecrats, and then we have the disenfranchised people that don't ascribe to any party, that often don't vote, they don't feel an allegiance. We need to change that dynamic, and the way to do it is bring everybody into the electoral process, not make it more difficult to vote. We need to have transparent elections, and they're currently not as transparent as they could be. We should talk about election integrity. And we need to have reduced barriers to voting. We need to get rid of the gerrymandering, and that's another whole hour-long conversation. But we need to get rid of gerrymandering where the election process is rigged to support one party or the other. It should be rigged to support the voter and the voter's choices.
We're almost out of time, so I need short answers on this last question. Why are you a better choice than Republican Scott Walker and Democrat Tony Evers?
First of all, I don't belong to either tribe. I'm not locked into their positions. I'm willing to stand up and talk about what's really important instead of what the party structure says I'm allowed to talk about. That's number one. Number two, I don't have any ego involved in this. I don't have anything that I have to prove. I just want to fix my children's future, because my children's future, your grandchildren's future, are in jeopardy.
Thank you. Michael White of La Crosse is a Green Party candidate for governor. The election is November 6th. Mr. White, thanks for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel.